Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love, Shamika Michelle, and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love alongside my co-hosts, Shamika Michelle and Wilfred Riley. And our guest this week is Howard Husock, Senior Fellow, Domestic Policy Studies at AEI, American Enterprise Institute, and the author of The Poor Side of Town and Why We Need It. There's the book. Howard, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Charles.
Well, it's great to have you. I remember, I was so excited about this topic, and I wanted to talk about the topic before I knew who I was going to talk to. I was connected to you, and then we met, and then your story and your conversation about bourgeois values was so interested. I interviewed you, and that's all we talked about. So we never even got to this. So it's good to finally be able to talk about housing, helping the poor, and the right and wrong ways to do that. But quickly, I guess you should summarize briefly. We'll get into some detail, but what the book is about and why you wrote it.
Well, thanks so much for having me on, and hi to Shamika and Will too. My book is about how there used to be a formula. We just go and scratch our heads about how do we create affordable housing. And my book says we used to know how to do it, and it was really pretty simple. It was small houses on small lots in maybe neighborhoods that were not that rich, but where people owned their house, or maybe it was a two-family, or maybe it was a three-family, where they rented to their neighbors or their in-laws, and they had communities. And a school of thought developed that these were slums, and they had to be wiped out and replaced by public housing and other forms of subsidized housing. And one of the points I make in the book is that particular non-beneficiaries, particular victims of this, have been African Americans. And I say that because today, 47% of the residents of public housing are Black. 40% of housing voucher recipients are Black. 54% of other forms of subsidized housing are Black. Now, some people are going to say, well, that's because Black people are poor. And I say, no, it's because Black people were in the cities at a time when their neighborhoods were bulldozed. Their wealth was wiped out, and they were directed into places where they couldn't accumulate wealth. Mm-hmm. And that Black people are continuing to bear the burden of that today. So that's the summary of the book, with a particular emphasis on a concern of mine particularly.
All right. I guess we should start. You say we had a formula. So talk about what these neighborhoods look like, even before some people started with better formulas to kind of dial back the problems that happened when they started public housing. But, you talk about in the book, you do a great job of setting up how we got that. And as usual, the people who don't know this won't really be surprised when they hear it. It's usually some well-meaning elite person who doesn't live in that circle, seeing something and deciding that no one should live like that, which is a nice thing to do, but they never talk to the people who live like that or get a better enough understanding, sit back quiet long enough to get an understanding and say, do they move out of this or are they stuck like this? They just say it's bad, we must fix it and go. So you talk about Jacob Riis and right. Him writing as a journalist. So talk a bit about that, the picture he painted of the tenements.
Jacob Riis, for those who don't know him, wrote a famous book in 1890 called How the Other Half Lives. And he was a brilliant writer and especially a brilliant photographer. At a time when flash photography was relatively new, he went into the tenements of the Lower East Side of New York and took pictures of people in conditions that didn't look very nice. The thing to know about Jacob Riis was, before he was a housing crusader, he was a police reporter. He was a sensationalist. And so he wanted to make things look as bad as possible because that was what was going to get people's attention. That was the business he was in. He was the Michael Moore of his day, if you will. And he was very, very successful in outraging middle-class Americans about the conditions in the Lower East Side. But as a biographer of his, Jacob Riis was a Danish immigrant. There's a Danish biographer of him who's just written very recently a book, said he never talked to the people who lived there and asked them, how do you feel about this? And in reality, people who lived in poor neighborhoods that were labeled slums starting in the late 19th century, going into the Great Depression, consider their condition to be better than what they left behind, often in Europe. They considered themselves to be wayfarers. They were planning to move up and out. And in fact, many of them did do that. But Riis literally drew us into what I call the snapshot fallacy. You take a snapshot of something that looks so bad that you say, we got to fix this. And he started us on this path toward high-rise public housing projects, zoning that would zone out the small buildings that people could own and buy and accumulate wealth.
So Will, what do you think about that? I mean, we all have seen the pictures, right? Everybody goes back and they show pictures of these dirty-faced people, living in squalor, and there are many people living in a unit, sharing a bathroom, there's public bathhouses, all this kind of stuff. And obviously we look at it from today and it's just a totally different mindset, even from the poor. The poor today would probably look at that and was like, oh, I'm glad I'm living here, without understanding the intricacies. So what are your thoughts on, what he reported on and what the poor lived like then? You talk a lot about what life was like back then.
No, I have a couple of thoughts about this. I mean, first of all, I'm from originally the south side of Chicago, and you're from Gary. You're from pretty near that area. So I've actually seen, probably in the second city to New York, some of those famous pictures of kind of like dirty-faced Irishmen and Jews and the first Black migrants, like standing in front of the wood stove in the old school tenement. I mean, I've seen the images that inspired kind of modern public housing. What's funny, though, is that as soon as the projects went up within about 10 years, I mean, Cabrini Green, Robert Taylor homes, all of those became legendary as hellholes as well. And you started seeing the exact same pictures of dirty-faced Black kids or the last remaining whites, now heavily Hispanics, standing in these miserable complexes or inside apartments that they really couldn't leave. So, I mean, there's a lot there. To some extent, I mean, if we're discussing unfortunate reality, a large, densely concentrated neighborhood full of poor people who sometimes drink and use drugs is rarely going to look utopian. So you're going to have to decide what is the best of the possible available options with utopia not on the table. I don't think anyone right now thinks that government intervention with project housing was successful. But one thing, one of the points Howard made is that if we're going to do anything here, one of the best solutions, if we're looking at kind of semi-poverty, working class housing, seems to be kind of small, clean home on a small lot in, quite frankly, a poor neighborhood. One of the things that's striking is that that's what many immigrants do now. I mean, when I moved out of Chicago, the area my mom moved into was the east side of nearby Aurora. And that's exactly what you saw. I mean, when people say these things like there's nowhere you can live in a home within a large urban metro area, those tend to be upper middle class, in my experience, white or Black kids, and they have really specific ideas about where it's acceptable to live. Many of these neighborhoods were mostly Hispanic, Jamaican, Bosnian, and so on Americans, and the general profile was that people would do things to the point where it almost became a joke on the schoolyard, right? But people would do things like live 2 or 3 families to a house with the father of one of the families owning the house. Or people would buy a small house from their former landlord. I mean, all of these now are owner occupancy buildings in that area. So yeah, you'd have the stability of a bunch of people living in a moderately well-built house in a working class area. The question now, to some extent, and this gets into kind of what are called the NIMBY and YIMBY movement. So yes, if you're gonna be poor, that's the best way to be poor. Live in your own house in a neighborhood with a bunch of other poor people that care about their neighborhood. The question is, how can you do that? I mean, I was in a vicious argument on social media the other day that I did not expect to progress along these lines, quite frankly. I thought we were just talking about this pleasant subject of housing. But I mean, very many cities, almost any suburb, even Aurora now is technically a suburb. You're looking at massive restrictions on where you can build residential, where you can build commercial. I mean, many of these Aurora homes, in fact, were technically in violation of the law, more than 6 persons to a residence. You're looking, no SROs, as they're called, no single room occupancies. You're looking at these massive restrictions on how you can put poor people together in kind of a relatively decent, imperfect home. There's a book about this, The Death of Common Sense, about this kind of contrast between the ideal housing codes that were designed in the 50s and 60s and how people are actually going to have to live if they don't have much money. And I've never really seen an area where that's reconciled. Right. If you said in this city, we're going to build a bunch of decent, quote unquote, tiny homes, we're going to put 7 people apiece in them, and we're going to enforce laws to keep this neighborhood clean and well policed. The question I would have for you as a Frankfurt City Councilman or something is how?
Well, that's a good point. And there's a lot about that in the book. And I know Howard's going to get to some.
Yeah, quite a bit.
We should do that. But Shamika, here's an interesting thing. One other problem that I would say wouldn't have been much of a problem back then because people were doing it. Will mentioned that immigrants do it now, but that led to what I wanted to ask you about. Because in order to get this push, and eventually Howard's going to talk about some solutions and things we should do. And part of it is offering people opportunities to live in certain areas, but be able to own instead of never being able to build wealth. But think about the people today. Like Will made the point. Some immigrants today, people who immigrate from wherever in the world, do that, and then they eventually achieve the American dream. And others, many Black Americans, will look at that, maybe the next generation of them, and say they must have done something different. They have a different mindset, or something's unfair because this guy can just come over here from a third world country and his kids are doing well and we're struggling. So my question to you, Shamika, is will the average, single mom, 20-something Black family live in some of the conditions that the immigrants are willing to suffer through in order to, don't nod, I haven't even asked, in order to achieve that level of both personal responsibility and ownership, or put off that immediate gratification so down the road their kids or later in their life they can be more successful? Because I'm thinking that if given that opportunity, we have progressed to or regressed to the point that many people would not do that.
Yeah, I don't think many people would. And I guess I have a couple of questions, because even with you saying that, like, I know people that live in the projects who obviously aren't paying that much rent, but they don't save any money either. And they will like deck their houses out. There's a girl in the projects now, probably more than one, but one for sure that I know of, that has a stripper pole in her house. House is laid as if she was in, a middle class, place, the big screen TVs that are smart screen, smart TVs. They live lavish lifestyles in the project. So no, I don't think they would ever live like some of the immigrants, because they want this lifestyle that they really can't afford. But that's the way for them to afford it, by living in a place where they pay $50 or $100 a month, and then just splurging with what they do have. And I was having a conversation with someone today, like, and I want to know, how do you have affordable housing? Because she was talking about how when she lived in a project community, how the people were bad, the kids were bad or whatever. And she moved up to what should have been a nicer neighborhood, but it's still affordable housing. And it's still the same type of people that are over there shooting or causing trouble. So like, what is the cause of that? And how do you then provide affordable housing for people whose behavior is still project?
Right. I'll let Howard get in there, but just quickly, that person you said that moved out, when they moved out of the projects to another place, was that place public housing as well? Just like row houses or what?
No, it wasn't public housing, but it was affordable housing.
So they had a voucher. It was a voucher thing where they can.
They have townhomes, and you can't make over a certain amount.
Gotcha, right.
live
So it's
there.
income
Yeah.
based, right?
Yeah,
Gotcha.
in Chicago, that's like a step away from the projects. It's like to live in the towers, quote unquote, you can't make more than 60% of the
Yep.
median income.
Mhm.
And I think just very quickly, Shamika just made one of those points no one dares to make about the projects, which was that when they were originally built, whether these were for Black families in the North, poor whites in the South, whatever, the projects were considered nice. They were supposed to be an improvement over the slums people were living in. And if you look at the old design plans for Cabrini Green, which I have in an architecture class, they were a substantial improvement over, for example, the Lower East Side, which is cited. The problem was what PJ O'Rourke once summed up as you can't stack poor people who drink. We've seen this everywhere from Rio to Dublin. I mean, when you moved hundreds of thousands of people into these buildings, you brought in those gang rivalries, drugs, prostitution, they rapidly became terrible places no one wanted to go. The apartments in the projects, you ever go to the hood to buy weed and hang out with a friend or whatever people might have hypothetically done in high school, you're often looking at much nicer places than where you were living in the time, in a dorm room or a studio apartment or whatever you were paying for. So that again is part of the deal. Are you willing to leave a subsidized, dangerous, but fun lifestyle for a boring, mundane one, just living in a working class neighborhood, paying the rent and doing your gutters?
Howard, your thoughts on any of that?
That's a lot to unpack there, guys. First of all, I want to say that there was a time when Black people were living like immigrants, because they were immigrants. They were immigrants from the South to the North. In my book, I talk about a neighborhood in Detroit called Black Bottom. It wasn't called Black Bottom for a racial reason. It had black soil when the French came there. This was a neighborhood where there were hundreds, 300 plus Black-owned businesses, where the Urban League was active, where Aretha Franklin's father had his church. I'm not making that up. And it got wiped out, demolished, and replaced by the Brewster Douglas housing projects. Now, those housing projects at first, when it's new, they were nice. But remember, the theory was that the rents of the residents were going to keep the upkeep going. But over time, anybody who could go somewhere else did go somewhere else. So you only had the very poorest people living there, and they deteriorated more and more. Now, the point here, I don't want to go where Shamika's going. I get that there are people like that, but I don't want to go there. I want to believe in the Black working class. I do believe in it, but they have terrible incentives in public and subsidized housing. The more money you earn legally on the books, the more your rent increases. You got that? Would anybody ever sign a lease like that if you had a choice? I'm going to sign a lease where if I earn an extra dollar, I pay an extra 30 cents in rent. That is reality for everybody in the projects. They have an incentive to blow their dough. They have the wrong incentives.
Right.
Can you own an apartment in public housing? No, you can't. So I think the incentives are wrong. And I don't want to, I don't want to say.
So how do you fix it? Because you say you don't want to go there, but there are people living like that. And I live right around the corner from the projects. I hear them shooting over there. I visit these people. Like the projects is where I hung out growing up.
Yeah, I think going there is kind of important. I've been to the projects a lot as like the guy
I've
who plays sports
I've been
in
to the
Chicago.
projects. I've been to the projects too. You know.
No, I mean like hanging out, spending.
No, I haven't hung out in the
know,
projects.
that's what I mean.
I have hung out in projects. It was a long time ago. But let me just say this. I think we have to change the rules. I can't fix people's behavioral choices, but I think we can change the rules and gradually improve things. Here's what I would suggest. You should have a fixed lease.
Yep.
The rent doesn't change for as long as you're there. If your income goes up, you get to put that money aside in an account that you can save for when you graduate from the projects after a fixed time period, just like with welfare. You get 5 years, maybe you get 7 years, maybe you get 3 years. But during that time, your rent doesn't go up if your income goes up. Your rent doesn't go up if you get married and you have 2 incomes. Your rent doesn't go up if you have another single mother move in with you to share the burdens of child rearing.
Mm-hmm.
You you change the rules so that people have an incentive to save, but they also have a warning. This is only for 5 years now, and you got to make the best of it because then you're out. There are housing authorities, just a few of them, that actually do that and are having better results. If you have these reservations where people just stay forever and have a disincentive for improving themselves, you're going to get these bad results, and they're tragic.
Right. I think it's also important to note that Shamika may be correct about some of the problems that have occurred in some of these neighborhoods and these housing projects, but a lot of that is because of the decisions that the government made that created it, right? So they didn't like the way the slums look. They wanted to fix them. So they've got the bright idea that government running the housing would be better, but along the lines of all the things he said, tying the rent to the to your income, so you're trying not to make more money. Subsidizing so much to the point that it costs so much to build it that nobody can make any money. You're losing money on it, so you lose it. So here's a great example. So you talked about Black Bottom, your own neighborhood in Brookline and other neighborhoods that were like this. You talk about Levittown after they started doing public housing, people who kind of bucked that system. So can you paint the picture of what these neighborhoods lost when they moved them from what seemed to be slums that nobody should be living in to the projects, right? So all the things you talk about, like the ability to own, but the businesses, the sense of community, what did they lose by moving from what seemed to be poor neighborhoods, but neighborhoods that they were sustaining, to the government-run facilities?
You lose community. That is the key. You lose community. You lose what I call owner presence. So in Black Bottom, in DeSoto Car in St. Louis, which was destroyed to build Pruitt-Igoe, which was then itself imploded, in Cedar Central in Cleveland, in East Harlem, you had buildings where you had people living on one floor and renting out those other floors. They were providing not only income for themselves, we talk about the black-white wealth gap. We created it. We created it by wiping out the chance to accumulate wealth, by directing Black people into subsidized housing. Black people came to the cities post-World War II. 1949 was the amendments to the National Housing Act that brought urban renewal. It was a terrible, tragic coincidence for Black people to come to the cities at the same time that urban renewal was happening. Their neighborhoods got wiped out in the guise of doing a favor for them. But Shamika, and Will are really asking the right question. I love to rehearse the history because it outrages me so much. But it is the right question. How do we go forward now? It's a hard question. It's a hard question. Changing the rules on subsidized and public housing. 47% of public housing are Black people. That's crazy. Right. We got to change the rules. But to build more small houses on small lots is going to take a lot of persuasion.
Right. You need to
at
sell
the
it.
Local level. NIMBY is a problem. The missing middle, people are talking about that. It is a problem. It's going to have to go planning board by planning board in Aurora and other places like that. And the well has been poisoned by public housing because all those little planning boards are so scared they're going to get the projects moving in. Mm-hmm. And they say, well, no, we'll just keep everything out.
Right.
So it's going to be a hard tooth by, I don't know the metaphor I'm looking for it, but it's going to take step-by-step persuasion. You're going to have to tell people, this is not for poor welfare mothers. This is for your children to have a place to live. It's for teachers and firefighters in your towns. Mm-hmm. It's for the working class. So that then that welfare mother or former welfare mother will see, well, I can move up there. I can move to that too if I save my money. So we have to increase the supply of modest housing. And that is a challenge for the whole country because the decisions are made by thousands of little zoning boards.
Right, right. And you're talking about changing mindsets. But even with the implosion of Pruitt-Igoe and several others, like Will mentioned, Cabrini Green, Robert Taylor, Home Stateway Gardens, they're all gone. But no one seems, at least from a government side, seems to be learning from what happened. So they still are pushing for similar things, just doing it different. So we still need the government to have the greater control of housing. We're just going to do it. The first step was, you talk about this in the book, vouchers, right? So, okay, you're not in a project, but we're just going to give people a stipend so they can go live wherever. And they're still tying it to income. It's still the same thing, but now you're not having a community because you're mixing people. It's forced. So both sides seems to be confused. One side, the NIMBY side is on one side, but on the other side, there's like, well, I'll move to this neighborhood. It's supposed to be a safer, more affluent neighborhood, but there's a level of resentment to that person who's doing it. And then some places, I know in Chicago, they had this thing that they call the super voucher. And you talk about something kind of similar to that. I forgot where in the book, but it was where, so we're giving these vouchers and people can go and find Section 8 or subsidized housing. But there was this belief that if you take poor people and you move them to affluent neighborhoods, they can just rub the shoulder and they're going to act differently, live differently, and do whatever. So they gave them, so it was like the lotto for private schools or whatever. So you got like, there was only 100 of them in the whole city, but you got one of those super vouchers, you got like what was $5,000 a month, right? So you can go live in River North, or you can go live in the more affluent neighborhoods. And then they scrapped it because it was so few people. The people who lived in those buildings didn't like it. I know they did something similar in New York, and they had a poor door because the poor people and the other people entered through the separate entrances. It's like, it just doesn't make sense trying to force people to live this fake community and this mixed income neighborhood, and talk a bit about how they're going further than that, and then eventually what they're doing with the suburbs.
Well, I'm going to build off what Shamika said about people making bad choices. I think that the process of doing the things that you need to do to move to a better neighborhood, that process itself is the point. Mm-hmm. Right? In other words, you save, maybe you have two incomes in your family. You think about what's the best education for your child.
Double up.
Maybe you do double up, but you take the steps that allow you to move to that better neighborhood. Then you don't have to think about this as a favor that you've been given.
Right.
You've worked your way up. That sense of achievement is crucial. And as long as we're directing people into subsidized housing rental, they will not have the chance to accumulate wealth. And whether it's the low-income housing tax credit, which is the latest flavor, or it's mixed income housing, how are we so sure that people want to live in mixed income housing? Liberal elites have decided that, well, you should want to live that way because the projects were so bad they were all poor. We'll create this new formula, that'll be better. They keep striving, they keep guessing, but really it's striving and saving that help you move your way up. And foreshortening that in any way does no favor for the people for whom it's supposed to benefit.
Will, what do you think about that? I think that's interesting because we talked about, and there's definitely problems in it. I mean, not necessarily racism, but definitely an elitism to people saying, well, I've made this money and I don't want certain types of people living in my neighborhood. But there's something to it. It's the same thing as the kid. Sometimes the kid who goes to a really swanky private school and he gets the scholarship, and sometimes the kids bully him and like, look at the poor kid, which definitely happens. But sometimes the poor kid says, I don't think I belong here, right? The kids could be really nice to him and they're still like, oh, look, they all have BMWs in the parking lot and I'm taking 2 buses. So there's a resentment. So do you think there's some similar things that if you force it, like Howard said, it's important to actually feel the positive energy of working your way there like the people before you did, but there's something to just sticking them there and saying, move to this neighborhood where everybody, I don't know, makes $150,000 a year and you're being subsidized, how you take being in that neighborhood.
Well, I think there are a couple of things here. I mean, it was good to hear the last line from Howard, and I enjoyed the book. I mean, I think that final point we obviously want to avoid racism, we want to avoid classism, but there are very clear things like striving, saving. As long as the government's not too much in your way, we know what predicts success. I mean, I think everyone on this panel has been a boss. It's just an obvious statement of fact. So, I mean, of course, there's tribalism among human beings, and it's unfortunate. Like, sure, it kind of sucks sometimes, at least if you weren't a very socially fluid person or an athlete or something like that, to go to a wealthy school as a poor kid. I will note it would suck a lot more to go to a hood school as a rich kid, by the way. But I mean, that would be a far worse experience.
Yeah, especially when you lose that BMW.
Having to defend yourself with your hands and so on. But I mean, just like, but of course, that final point, there are traits that are going to predict success. And while you're developing those, you might clash with, for example, the sort of neighbors you're going to have in an upscale River North condo building. I think that goes without saying. That was actually a point of tension in Chicago when I lived in our young professional district. I don't know if these were super vouchers because the apartments around me cost maybe $1,700 a month or something like that. But there was considerable tension with various mayoral programs that were moving in people from, the perception was sort of all around the city to live in these buildings that people were really striving to live in. And often these weren't scions of the WASP upper class. I mean, this was a mix of Mexican, Jewish, et cetera, American guys that just had good jobs. So you're going to get that tension. But one thing that I think no one's mentioned, including me so far, is just the role of family here. I mean, this is just extraordinarily obvious. I mean, so when you look at the immigrant advantage, like, so someone on the panel, I think it might have been Shamika, mentioned the idea that Black Americans, and I don't want to keep breaking people in these damn groups, but in Kentucky, this would also be Appalachian Americans, by the way. We'll see people come from somewhere like Ethiopia. And the next generation, they'll see that guy's son, after he started a successful cab company, go to the University of Louisville, and they'll ask, what is the government doing to help these damn foreigners? What's the trick they have up their sleeve? There is no magic trick. The difference is basically just family stability. So, I mean, when you look at why Mexican-American families in that neighborhood I mentioned were more able to buy homes, racism was a small factor without minimizing that. But one of the realities was just there was almost always a working father. There was generally a working mother as well. I mean, if you had a son over 14, he was working, and so on down the line. So you had 3 or 4 incomes. And I would assume that in most of these traditional homes, if you're trying to leave the Lower East Side, that's what you're talking about. Whereas, like, we've all been to the projects, like the paradigmatic project family is a young mom with 2 or 3 kids, generally who are too young. By the way,
that's accurate. That is accurate.
I know. Yeah. I've dated some. I mean, I'm not trying to at all make fun of this. It's a tragedy. We need to fix it. But like, we're all from big cities. We know what this is, you know. So one of the issues I read recently, Bosnian Americans, again, it's the last time I'm going to racialize a group, but Bosnian Americans in Chicago, obviously working class population, came into the city heavily, 1996, big bloody war in Yugoslavia. The former Yugoslavia, by the way, not exactly a leading first world country. Spent some time in the project. The average time a Bosnian American spent in public housing was 1.5 years.
18 months.
What made that happen? Family ties, the Orthodox churches, the men coming over from the old country once their military service was done, these warriors that had fought the Serb army that were going to take their wives and look for a home. I mean, it was that stability that made that time frame possible. I've found that a remarkable statistic. I'm sure someone in the comments will correct it by a few months. But that sort of thing is utterly essential. How do you build those habits? I mean, Howard, I think when you're talking about what we can do from the outside, I think the key point is just don't disincentivize people.
Right.
Don't have the government, excuse the language, actively fuck people. Like, I've always preferred UBI to welfare, right? So like you did an excellent, this is my last sentence, but you did an excellent illustration of the welfare trap, where if you make an extra buck, or you give the government 40 cents back, why would you do that? Why would you not sell weed on the side, the things that you actually see people do? It would make more sense just to give people money with no conditions. But I think an even better version is what's been called the Civilian Conservation Corps model. You condition the receipt on behavior instead of money. So if you're going to live in a nice upscale building, you have to do X, Y, Z, apply for so many jobs, apply for so many new locations, as versus just you live there forever. And if you ever do better, we take what you earn. The model right now, I absolutely agree with you, by the way, I think we're all on the same page, is virtually designed to guarantee generational failure. And it does. It works as advertised. It works down here just as well on whites, by the way. There's no racialized magic.
Right. And I want to get in Shamika in here and see what you have to say about this. But I do want to I think I said it earlier, but it's important to say it again because, like, you know, I guess to cleanse the palate of all of Will's racializing. We have a problem with the single mother, and it's just because it's nothing against her, but that things struggle more if you don't have the help. All those things we already talk about, and a lot of that has to do with your decisions or positions, you know, decisions you make. But the government did a lot to, you know, exacerbate that problem and to add on it all these things you're talking about. Well, if you make more money, you get penalized. So why make more money? Or why get married? Because if I bring my income in, we lose all this stuff. So a lot of these things that was strictly based to these reformers that Howard talks about in his book caused this, and we need to understand that that is the case. The problem is everybody says all the causes are racist 100% of the time. And so it limits them from looking at other possible causes. They may not all be racist, though some of them are, but they're all government, are the vast majority of them. And then once you get used to it, you just keep going in that way because it's been generational. So Shamika, what would you like to add?
No, I think I'm just listening and I'm calming down because initially I thought Howard was you know, like rejecting my input as someone on the outside looking in when I feel like I've been on the inside looking around. And so, like, if we're going to actually solve the problem, I would like for us to look at the entire picture, because again, I was talking to someone today, you know, like I have friends
with stripper poles, got it,
in the projects. And so we were having the conversation, how do we have affordable housing, which is necessary, without all of the crime and the mess that you deal with when you put people of low income together. So it would seem from what everybody is saying is behavior, and then also not penalizing them if they make more. So I'm just kind of listening to some of the things that, you know, maybe I can take back to my own people here, like as we talk about even building more affordable homes. And I know for myself, I'm just listening to you all, I wouldn't want the affordable person living beside me. I mean, there's a Section 8 house here is what I'm saying, and they're missing pieces of the blinds. And I think we do have to consider like everything, and not, you know, leave certain things out. I am seeing people in the projects with Mercedes and Range Rovers and, you know, iPhone 13s, and like, they aren't as poor as we think they are, maybe, or people think they are. Something is keeping them from saving. Like if this was what they were supposed to be in, to save and be able to come up out of that, they're not doing it. So what is keeping them from doing that, I guess, is my concern. Because I know generations that have been in the projects. The 5-year thing would be great, but they aren't leaving. Why?
Well, I'll let Howard respond to that, but it's two things I want to say. Is one, you mentioned the generational piece. So some of the problems are because we let them go on so long. And then, you know, we can all have some disagreements, but I don't think you talked about Howard's response. He's definitely not saying that your views on this is weird, because in fact, in the book, he writes about how they tried to racialize it, saying that, you know, in the past, and then years after that, the next guy would come up and push up against it. I guess when Cuomo was brought on to try to assuage the neighborhood for bringing people in, you know, he noticed that, well, these people aren't racist. They kind of make a point, right? They worked their way up, moved from poor neighborhoods to this neighborhood, and now they're trying to just jam poor people in who haven't made the same steps that they made.
Yeah, I heard eventually he wasn't saying that, but I don't want to go there.
No,
we got to go all the way there. If we go solve the problem, we got to include.
We got to include that. But that's why I just think it's important to say, you know, and I will turn it to Howard, but he's not the only one. We're just talking about his book, but a lot of people have done studies on this, and they say, you know, like in the 1619 project, you know, I wrote the book and I wrote a chapter about traffic, and they were saying, using Atlanta example to prove that interstate highways, remember Pete Buttigieg, the interstate highways are racist. So they were like, see, look at Atlanta. And they tried multiple times to get this suburb to get this busing so people from the city can go to the suburb. And the racist whites kept voting it down. And they neglected to tell you, I did the research, they neglected to tell you that the third time they did it, 60% of the people who voted no were blacks who lived in the suburbs. So they could still be wrong. It's not me saying they're right, but don't just say it's just a bunch of racist whites saying we don't want to move. It's black people who lived in those neighborhoods, the west side of Chicago, certain areas in Atlanta, save their money to move out. And they say, I moved to get away from that. Why are you moving it back to me? So, it's not, so when you say, I don't want them living next to me, I'm not saying that you're necessarily right or wrong, and I don't think Howard is either, but it's important to note both that everybody who's saying that isn't necessarily a racist, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that
Can I give a
solves the
quick
problem.
comment there?
Yes.
Yeah, one of the issues I have with this, and all of us, I think all of us, in fact, working class urban background, is the use of race as a proxy for class. So, I mean, this happens all the time. Like, who are these people in the East Atlanta suburbs voting down black migrants? Like, if you've ever done anything from go south on a business trip to listen to Gucci Mane, you know that the people in the East Atlanta suburbs are almost entirely going to be black taxpayers. So that's the answer to your question. I mean, and it's the same up here. It's the same in many places. I mean, the people objecting to travelers from the Lexington projects via bus line. I mean, this is Kentucky, right? Like that, those are not going to be primarily African American. So we can all want to help poorer countrymen without assuming that race is more than a 0.2 proxy for class. That in itself is wildly racist, by the way, 70 years after Brown. And that's something that continues to exist.
Well, the median length of stay in public housing in New York, which is by far the largest public housing system, is 20 years.
That's less than I would have thought.
Oh.
Whoa, wait, 20 years. Excuse me, I got to get it. But at 20 years, isn't your kid already outgrown?
Yeah, and they pass them along.
You stay?
They pass them along to their kids.
They do. They do that here
Okay,
too.
that's how it's only 20 years. It's your unit while you have an under 18 accompanied minor. Thanks, Howard. That suddenly made a lot more sense. So then your child would stay. Okay.
Yeah, and the percentage of two-parent with children families in public and subsidized housing, 4%. 4%. So
yeah, that makes sense. I can see that.
That's right. There's a lot of elderly people, but then among the non-elderly, the single mother is not a stereotype. Right. It's the reality. And so our challenge, look, I think it's very difficult to tell Black Americans that you should be more like immigrants, because Black Americans have been here since the beginning of the country. That's a very difficult sell. Right. But most Black Americans have done that. And so the question is, how do we incentivize, go back to that term, what are now kind of a disorganized underclass, a minority of a minority, to become more like a working class? Mm-hmm. Poor neighborhoods are not inevitably going to be bad neighborhoods. They shouldn't be bad neighborhoods. They should be policed. They should have good parks. They should have good schools. And with the right incentives and get rid of these bad disincentives, mm-hmm. I think we can encourage that lady with the stripper pole to say, you know what, I got to make a better choice here, mm-hmm. Because I only got 3 more years in this project.
Right.
And then I don't know what I'm going to do. I think that would focus your attention.
Yeah.
Well,
sure.
I mean, I talk about solutions a lot generally, but Shamika has been honed in on the whole hour. Like, I want to talk solutions. Right. So let's talk about a couple of the interesting things that you say that may shock some people. Your selling off of assets in your reparations. They'll like that, reparations.
Yeah, I am kind of for a form of reparation. A lot of public housing projects stand on really valuable real estate. There's a housing project in New York that's worth more than $1 billion because it's on the Brooklyn waterfront or it's on the Lower East Side. That's true in Philadelphia. It's true in Savannah. It may be true in Frankfort, Kentucky. I don't know. It may be true in Durham, North Carolina. That the real estate, if you were to do something else with it, if you were to put it on the market, you can do anything with this. You can tear down the project and you can build, a shopping mall before the shopping malls were not worth building anymore.
Right.
or
Expand a university or something.
right. But what I say is take that money that you're going to earn by selling it off, distribute it to the tenants. You get a send-off. You're going to get $50,000 each, $75,000 each. It's a nest egg for you because you weren't allowed to earn appreciation for all those years. Now, don't come crying back in 5 years, I need a place to live.
Right.
We're going to pay reparations. I'm willing to call that. I use that term in testimony before the United States Senate Banking Committee. I said, we have to have public housing reparations. A Republican senator from Pennsylvania said, that's a good idea. We'll extricate people from the projects, but we won't leave them like the guy coming out of prison with $10 in a garbage bag. We're going to give them a nest egg based on the value of their property. And that could be a practical solution too. Not every public housing project is on valuable real estate,
right?
But many of them are.
And quickly to those that are, I'll get you a minute, because just it popped in my head when you said that. Now, it's not really a knock, it's just an observation, because like Will said, I'm from Gary. So, grew up poor and working class. And when I used to start, in my 20s, start to go to Chicago, whatever, and I would see these projects when they were still occupied. And they were kind of, like you say, in prime real estate, which is not a knock. But then when they started to decide what to do with them,
right,
people started to say like, well, they can't move these people out. Right now, whether they give them money or not is an issue. I don't really have a problem with that, but they were saying you can't move them as if to say they had some inherent right to live in River North. And I'm like, but I work every day and work overtime and I can't afford to live there. So how can you just say people have the right to live like 2 blocks from downtown, right? Like Cabrini Green was like, now what's Cabrini Green, what used to be Cabrini Green, is like, probably more now. At the time they built them, about 400,000. I think they're townhomes that are probably, $600,000 to $800,000. Right. And then so they took it and turned it into single family homes. But when they did it, the people say, well, we have a right to live in this neighborhood. So they equate whatever your views on housing rights to certain neighborhoods. And that just seemed odd to me.
Well, I might like to live on the Upper East Side of New York, but I can't afford to live on the Upper East Side of New York. That is the reality that we as Americans face. But, instead, when the Robert Taylor homes were knocked down, the Ida B. Well homes, the
Ickeys,
all these were famous progressives. Right. Ida B. Wells was a famous anti-lynching crusader.
Right.
We have all these projects named for Black people who were really accomplished people who should be role models. James Weldon Johnson, Ida B. Wells,
look at what they did.
Hughes, Frederick Douglass. It's tragic.
But I got to say this because I give shout out to my hometown. So I'm from Gary, and we don't have high-rise projects, but they got projects that were a little bit lower, a little smaller. And there was a project called Dory Miller. And like you say, you write in the book, you talk about these, they name these things that turned out to be basically uninhabitable after these greats. So Dory Miller was the first Black person to get a Navy Cross. He basically was on the ship that got bombed at Pearl Harbor, pushed the dead guy out of the gun and took over the gun. And now for his heroism, we get people living in squalor, right? So it happened all over the country.
The implicit assumption by naming housing projects after famous Black people is these places are always going to be Black.
Right. That's what it's saying. Exactly. And you're assuming that if we name it after somebody great like Frederick Douglass, they'll keep it up. Right. They'll keep it up because look at the name that's out there, forgetting that in 2 generations, they're going to be like, I don't know who Ida B. Wells is.
Yeah, I doubt that they do.
Shamika, what were you going to say?
No, I was just thinking if they were to give people 50 to 75,000 to move out of the projects, I'm going to move in so that then I could.
So you can move out
with a check. But I'm listening.
No, they're tearing it down though. They're tearing it down.
Right. After they pay them, it's gone. They sold it, remember?
That's fine. I'll have a check.
Just go squat.
Yeah, I'm just gonna go and I'm gonna move in first before they decide to give the people the money.
Right.
But I'm listening to you all now. I've written myself some notes to see who the projects here are named after. Most of them are based on the street, but there's at least 2. I want to see who they're named after and why.
The worse the project, the better, the greater the person is. I'm sure they did
Yeah.
great things.
Yeah, my most notorious example is the James Weldon Johnson homes. He wrote "Lift Every Voice and Sing."
Mhm.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, I guess too, listening to you all talk about the property and how much it's worth, it's kind of helping me to see what's happening here in my own city. Some of the projects they have torn down, they are in places that are now like gentrifying, and they could, this could be worth a lot of money if they were to rebuild on those and actually, so yeah.
But the mistake that's often made is you tear down the project and say, well, we're going to build a mixed income project.
Right.
Right. But maybe that area is not right for housing at all. Maybe there's
Right.
some other purpose that the city today would be better off to have.
Right. And people always react to like you say, incentivizing and disincentivizing. So when you do things, people react to them. So when you talk about the mixed income, we got to talk about that a bit, because to average listeners, they'll say, well, it doesn't sound so bad. What's wrong with having mixed income? But kind of when you talked about the poor side of town, it was in a weird way kind of like that. So everybody in that closed community were all of the same socioeconomic status, but they were close enough to other things. So it's like it was a spread. Whereas what they do in these situations you're talking about, somebody gets zoning permission to build a high-rise luxury condo, but they say, all right, you can build it and we'll give you a little tax break, but you got to have 10% of the units be for people who make under $45,000, $50,000 a year. But even if it sounds nice, why? Again, it goes back to my question when I was poor, saying, well, why do they get the right? So middle class can't live there. The wealthy can afford it, and you're going to give a subsidy to the poor, but the middle class can't afford to live there. So it's not fair on its face. But beyond that, that developer has a mindset, not just the building. He's going to build it out and put a fancy charcuterie down before a restaurant. And he's going to put this stuff over here. He's going to put all this stuff in the neighborhood. So the people who can afford to live there because they got a voucher can't afford the stuff that's in the neighborhood, right? So then again, you're creating that rift between the two, where the mindset is, look at these uppity people thinking they're better than us with the sending us through the poor door. Let's snatch their purse, right? So it kind of creates. It's not like you're just everybody's some kind of criminal or anything, but you're creating an animosity that's playing into human nature.
Or it's a weirdness. It's a weirdness. I just feel like that. I think it was the video for Billie Jean, the Michael Jackson video. It might have been Thriller, but no, it wasn't Thriller. And he and another kid are on a subway in New York. Mm-hmm. And they're both wearing private school uniforms. Mm-hmm. And they catch each other's eye, two black kids. And one of them says to the other, "They proud of you?" And the other one says, "Yeah, they're really proud of me, man." In other words, they're patronized all day long. Mm-hmm. I would hate that.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
So to feel weird by the sufferance of rich people, I get to live here. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Who wants to live that way?
That's true. I mean, I couldn't put it any better. I think that all of those kind of play into the problem, but you give these things that we should do, the reparations, selling off the properties, building smaller homes and things of that nature.
Time limits.
Yep, the time limits are important. Changing some of the zoning. Talk about some of the zoning stuff they did, how they made it where it was impossible to create the inventory you needed to house people.
Well, single family zoning took the whole country by storm. After starting in the 20s, and then it got to be more and more, and then it's larger and larger lots. It's really interesting. The ultimate post-war suburb was Levittown in New York. Now, Levittown, they did some really bad things, like they excluded Black people. Yep. Really, really bad. And there was so much demand on the part of veterans to live there. That was the time when they would have looked past race, in my opinion. But the developer was afraid. Really a tragic mistake. But it's really worth looking at these houses. They were 750 square feet. Wow. And that was the post-war suburban house. Mm-hmm. You couldn't build that most places today. They were affordable because they were small. They had unfinished attics.
No
And
basement.
so-
They had to get special zoning so they didn't have to have a basement.
Yeah. So it's going to take strong-minded developers to go to local planning boards all over the country and say, you know what, that abandoned shopping mall, I want to turn it into 500 two-family houses.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of abandoned shopping malls. You can do that. That's for real.
That's true. That's true.
I
I
have a
still think
question.
it's going to be a hard sell to people now because they've gotten to the point, even so you got so many layers you have to deal with as a government, this, but then there's the people like Shamika's stripper pole friend who's just going to be like, I'm not moving into a 700 square foot house because we've been for so many generations building these big houses to bigger houses to McMansions, and now they see the celebrities and all the stuff on TV and their huge compounds and they want to live like them. What were you going to ask, Shamika?
No, I was going to say, so do we believe that Will talked about family earlier? Do we think the deterioration of family has played a part in the deterioration of housing projects? Because when I was little, they were safe. I felt like they were clean. The crime wasn't what it is now.
Anyone?
Well, she asked Will.
Oh,
I mean, anybody, yeah. Do you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think empirically
family.
the answer is just yes. So obviously a housing project has never been as safe as, a leafy tree-lined suburb, but it's also important to realize that we weren't imagining what we saw when we were growing up. This is one of the big reasons I'm usually on the right side of the aisle. I don't give a shit about stuff like gay marriage, honestly. But I mean, between 1968 and 1993, crime in the USA increased 500%. I mean, when you look at some of those areas like Cabrini Green, by the mid 1990s, when people I knew were going there to play in basketball tournaments and so on, the rate of murder was higher than it is in El Salvador or Somalia.
Jeez.
So no, that's not something you're imagining, that as the big cities collapsed after the quote unquote movement, as you saw white flight, middle class black flight, as you saw the riots every summer from 64 to 72, and then new rounds after Rodney King in the 90s and so on, that crime just spiraled out of control, that a lot of places became unlivable. And that went along with family collapse. So, I mean, not to just drop litanies of statistics, but I mean, remember our country changed dramatically in the really recent past. And this is true across everything, even people's views of sexuality. When you talk about things like drag queen story hour, I mean, I remember the last guest said, that would sound incomprehensible to anyone, black, white, liberal, conservative, maybe 50 years ago. But definitely with this sort of stuff as well. I mean, Walter Williams, a great black economist, pointed out around World War II, the black illegitimacy rate was 11%. For whites, It was 5%. I mean, so it's a good job, countrymen. They were doing even better. But yeah, all this went together. I mean, you saw 68 to 93 crime, and we were all kids in this period. Crime increased 500%. Illegitimacy in our community go from 20% by that point to 70. So yeah, it's those cities with the graffiti covered trains and the people hooking up in the back of the bus and people shooting bullets at cabs. That is something that actually happened. And one of my big worries is that that's something we're going to see again. It's going to be more diverse now.
I'm in New York. We're seeing it.
It's coming. It's already up. It's already back up there.
Oh man, it's bad. It's bad. But look, we had in the projects, we had man in the house rules. If there's a man in the house,
yeah, this is a big one.
You can't be living there, right? There was an active effort to put the poorest people at the head of the line. And how do you get to be the poorest person at the head of the line? By being a single mother.
Mm-hmm.
So we created, and we still do this.
mm-hmm.
That's how you get to be in that affordable apartment. You go to the head of the line if you are the
Yes.
poorest,
Yes, true.
so that's a bad incentive. We're reaping the whirlwind from this. I am simply not gonna, I'm not gonna blame your friend with the stripper pole. I don't like her choices, but I kind of get where that all happened from.
Well, we don't even know if she's using it. It could just be decorative, Shamika. But I will say that the book is important and enlightening, and I hope people. I mean, I'm kind of hopeful, but at the same time, I guess the things you point out are important for people to know. You give them a little, you do what I like, talk about solutions and talk about things we should do. But the other piece is that I'm concerned about, but it's also, if we talk about it more, like you say, it's conditioning, that people need to listen to this, not only about housing and think the government trying to help you, look at their track record, right? Because they haven't really changed, right? They shifted from big high rises to vouchers to push into the suburbs to different tactics, but they have the same worldview. The HUD, the secretary, everybody has the same view. So as long as the government is trying to fix a problem that's either a human nature thing, a problem they cause, or making it race when it's not really race, you should really think really hard, long and hard before you go along with it, because a lot of this is going to make the changes Howard's talking about, it's going to take some voting changes and pushing your local government. But I guess we'll leave it there. He is Howard Husock, Senior Fellow at AEI and the author of The Poor Side of Town. Howard, thank you so much for your time.
I really enjoyed
Thank you, Howard.
meeting Mika, seeing Will again, hearing you again, Charles. I appreciate you having me on.
I got a country to say, God bless the US of A, land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to say, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving the day.